The sea was calm that morning, a glistening stretch of blue reflecting the Caribbean sun. But inside cabin 7A of the Ocean Serenity, chaos had already unfolded. It began when a housekeeper, making her routine rounds, knocked twice and pushed open the door. What she found froze her breath in her throat. The bride, Eleanor Harrington, just 27, radiant only days earlier in her wedding gown, lay motionless on the cabin floor. Her skin was pale against the patterned carpet, her body twisted in a way no sleep could explain. Her perfume still lingered in the air, sweet and delicate, now mingling with something sharper, metallic. The sound of waves against the ships. Hull seemed cruelly indifferent. Within moments, security officers swarmed the narrow hallway. Passengers craned their necks from half-open doors, whispering rumors before facts could surface. The Honeymoon cruise, marketed as a voyage of eternal love, had become the setting for a nightmare. The husband, Daniel Harrington, sat slumped, in a chair near the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, eyes bloodshot, knuckles raw. He muttered fragments, half apologies, half accusations. That made little sense. When officers tried to question him, his voice cracked, first in denial, then in something closer to rage. He kept repeating one phrase. She lied to me. She lied about everything. News travels fast on a ship. By breakfast, the dining hall buzzed with theories. Some said it was a robbery gone wrong. Others whispered of violent jealousy. The reality was far more complicated and far more devastating because Eleanor Harrington was not who everyone believed she was. Her truth had been hidden for years, carefully tucked away, until love, secrecy, and betrayal collided in a single, irreversible act. The crime would not only shock the passengers trapped on board, but also ignite a media storm once the ship docked. Headlines would scream of murder, deception, and scandal. But beyond the sensationalism lay a human story, a woman searching for acceptance, a man spiraling under the weight of pride and shame, and a marriage destroyed before it had even begun. For investigators, the questions were immediate. How could a honeymoon end in bloodshed? What secret drove Daniel to murder his bride? And what does justice mean when love is built on lies and fear? As officers sealed off the crime scene, one detail emerged that shifted the tone of every whisper on board. A discovery that transformed the narrative from a tragedy of passion into something deeper, an unraveling of identity itself. Eleanor, the glamorous bride from New York, had been hiding a past she feared would end her chance at happiness. When Daniel uncovered that truth, his perception of their love twisted violently into betrayal. That morning, the captain addressed the passengers with a rehearsed calm. "There has been an incident," he said over the intercom, his voice trembling slightly. "We ask for your cooperation as the authorities conduct their investigation." The words did nothing to soothe the unease. Couples held each other closer. Parents shielded children from overhearing details. For Elena, it was too late. For Daniel, the walls of the ship closed in like a floating prison. The honeymoon cruise would continue toward its next port, but nothing would feel celebratory. A cabin once filled with laughter and champagne toasts had become the silent testimony of shattered trust. This is not just the story of a murder, it is the story of secrets, of fear, of what happens when love collides with identity and truth collides with pride. And to understand how a fairy tale wedding unraveled into tragedy, we must go back to New York City, to the bride and groom's pasts, and to the choices that set them both on a collision course with destiny. Before the blood and headlines, before the whispers on a cruise ship, there was New York City, a city of steel and secrets, where millions of lives overlap but rarely reveal the whole truth. Among them was Eleanor Morales, a woman who had learned, long before the world called her a bride, that survival meant carefully curating what she allowed others to see. Elena grew up in Queens, in a small brick apartment that rattled whenever the subway roared past. Her childhood was marked by silence and searching. Assigned male at birth, she always felt out of step with the body she inhabited. Schoolyards were cruel, and her father's stern lectures were colder still. When she tried to express herself, she was met with mockery or anger. By her late teens, she made a choice. She would leave behind the boy named Evan and step forward into the life she always knew belonged to her. Transition was not easy. There were nights of fear, mornings of exhaustion, and countless battles with bureaucracies and doctors. But there were also moments of triumph. First time in a dress that felt like freedom. First time someone called her by her chosen name without hesitation. Elena carried herself with grace, but underneath was a reservoir of loneliness. Her family, particularly her father, had cut ties. In their place, she built a chosen family of friends from New York's LGBTQ+ community, people who celebrated her courage. By her mid-20s, Eleanor had reconstructed her life. She worked at a high-end boutique in Soho, her poise and fashion sense drawing in wealthy clients. She was admired for her elegance, though few knew the battles she had fought to wear it so effortlessly. What she wanted most, however, was not luxury but love. A love that would not question her, that would not disappear when her past came to light. Enter Daniel Harrington. Daniel came from a different New York, Manhattan boardrooms, polished brownstones, and family dinners where appearances mattered, more than honesty. His father was a retired attorney, his mother, a devout Catholic who measured success in weddings and grandchildren. Daniel, the golden son, built a career in finance. He was ambitious, sharp, and accustomed to control, but beneath his carefully tailored suits was a gnawing emptiness. Despite his wealth, his relationships were fleeting. He yearned for something permanent, something he could parade before his family as proof that he had achieved the perfect life. There, worlds collided one rainy evening at a gallery opening in Chelsea. Eleanor, attending with a co-worker, stood by a painting of fractured glass. Daniel noticed her immediately, her composure, her quiet confidence. To him, she was the embodiment of mystery, the kind of woman who seemed untouched by the noise of the city. He struck up conversation, and for the first time in months, his charm didn't feel forced. For Eleanor, the attention was intoxicating, but dangerous. She had promised herself she would never again risk her heart without honesty. Yet, the fear of rejection lingered. When Daniel asked her to dinner, she hesitated, but the way he looked at her, as though she were the only person in the crowded room, wore down her caution. She said yes. Their romance unfolded quickly. Candlelit dinners stretched into midnight. Walks. Daniel admired her sophistication. Eleanor reveled in his steady confidence. Within months, they were inseparable. But while love blossomed, Elena's secret weighed heavily. Each laugh they shared, each kiss stolen on a subway platform, carried the question, when do I tell him? Daniel's family, at first, embraced Elena. His mother adored her elegance. His father respected her intelligence. Friends remarked on how Daniel seemed calmer, more centered. But privately, Daniel sometimes questioned why Elena avoided talking about her past. When he pressed, she would smile, change the subject, or say only, "Some stories aren't ready to be told." It was a deflection Daniel accepted, though uneasily. He was drawn to mystery, but he also craved control. And Elena, with all her beauty, remained just out of reach in the one place he wanted full access, her history. By the following year, Daniel proposed. It was on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, under twinkling city lights. Elena said yes with tears in her eyes, though deep inside, fear coiled tight. She had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. To confess now, she feared, would not only destroy Daniel's love, but humiliate her before his powerful family. The wedding was extravagant, held in a Manhattan ballroom, draped with white orchids and gold trim. Elena looked every bit the fairy tale bride, her gown sweeping across marble floors, her smile radiant beneath crystal chandeliers. Guests toasted the perfect couple, marveling at their whirlwind romance. Yet when Elena stood at the altar, Daniel's Hand clasped in hers, she felt her pulse thundering. She knew she was hiding the most important truth of her life, and that someday, somehow, it could unravel. That tension, love interwoven with secrecy, followed them onto their honeymoon cruise. Passengers remembered seeing them board. Elena, in a flowing dress, Daniel carrying champagne, the two of them laughing like teenagers in love. They looked, from the outside, like a couple who had everything. But appearances are fragile things. What no one saw was the fragility beneath Elena's laughter or the subtle edge in Daniel's gaze when she pulled away from personal questions. Their marriage began not with openness, but with a secret. And secrets, when pressed against the steel confines of a ship at sea, have a way of clawing to the surface. The journey that began in glittering Manhattan would soon descend into suspicion, revelation, and tragedy. But in those first days aboard the Ocean Serenity, neither Eleanor nor Daniel could imagine just how swiftly their dream would transform into a nightmare. The Ocean Serenity cut smoothly across the turquoise water, its polished decks gleaming under a Caribbean sun. For most passengers, the cruise promised indulgence, bottomless champagne, elaborate buffets, and the illusion that time itself had slowed. For Eleanor and Daniel Harrington, newlyweds only days into their marriage, it was meant to be the start of forever. In the beginning, it seemed just that. On their first evening, they strolled hand in hand along the promenade, the sea breeze tugging at Elena's silk shawl. Daniel ordered champagne for them both and raised his glass with a grin. "To us," he declared, his voice strong and sure. Eleanor smiled, but her laughter carried a faint tremor, almost too soft to hear above the music of the ship's band. For Daniel, the honeymoon was supposed to be proof, to himself, to his family, that he had found the perfect partner. Elena looked stunning in every setting, whether dancing in the ballroom or lounging by the pool. Other men glanced at her, sometimes too long, and Daniel's pride swelled each time he pulled her close. She was his, and that alone fed his sense of triumph. Yet beneath the glow of romance, tiny fractures began to appear. At night, when Daniel reached for her, Elena hesitated. She deflected with kisses that seemed rushed or whispered that she was tired. The excuses were gentle, but they lodged in his mind like splinters. On their third night, when he pressed harder, her eyes flickered with something he couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Daniel told himself not to overthink it, but he had been raised in a world where appearances were everything, and the slightest inconsistency gnawed at him. Elena's reluctance, her evasions when he asked about her childhood, her quiet way of retreating whenever intimacy deepened, all of it began to feel like shadows on the walls of their cabin. One afternoon, while Elena showered, Daniel sat on the edge of their bed, scrolling through her phone. He told himself it was harmless curiosity, just a husband learning more about his wife. But his fingers shook as he opened old messages tucked deep in her archive. Most were ordinary, notes from friends, reminders from work. Then he saw a name, Maya, and a thread of conversations stretching back years. "You're stronger than you think. They'll never understand, but you deserve happiness. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not enough." Words were vague, but their tone unsettled him. Why would his wife need constant reassurance? And who exactly was Maya, someone Eleanor had never mentioned? When Eleanor emerged from the bathroom, steam following her like a cloak, Daniel quickly set the phone aside, but his eyes lingered on her differently now, not just with desire, but with suspicion. At dinner that evening, while waiters paraded silver trays of lobster and filet mignon, Daniel asked, "Why don't you ever talk about your family?" Thus, tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp. Elena froze for half a beat before answering. "Some things are better left in the past." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Daniel pressed further. "But everyone has stories. Childhood memories, high school, first jobs. You never mention any of it. Why?" She set her fork down, gently. "Daniel, please, let's just enjoy this trip." Her evasion only deepened his unease. He spent the night replaying every conversation they had ever shared, every small omission. By dawn, his affection was tangled with suspicion. The turning point came at the ship's piano bar. Daniel had drunk more than usual, bourbon loosening his restraint. A fellow passenger, a middle-aged man from Texas, struck up a conversation. He boasted about his third marriage, warning Daniel half-jokingly, "You never really know who you marry until the honeymoon, my friend. Secrets come out fast at sea." The words, innocent in their intent, hit Daniel like a spark to dry tinder. Secrets. The very idea haunted him now. That night back in the cabin, Daniel confronted Elena again, his voice tight. "What aren't you telling me? What's this big mystery you keep locked away?" Elena's chest tightened. She had dreaded this moment since the day she said yes at the Met. She had convinced herself she could outrun it, that love could erase the need for confession. But the walls of the cabin felt smaller with each passing second, and Daniel's eyes were relentless. "I've given you everything," she whispered. "My love, my loyalty. Isn't that enough?" "Not when it feels like a lie," Daniel snapped. "Not when you flinch every time I ask about your past. What are you hiding?" Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She turned away, pressing her palms against the dresser as though steadying herself against an unseen storm. Finally, with a trembling voice, she said the words she had feared. "I wasn't born Elena. I transitioned years ago. My name used to be Evan." The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel stared at her, his mind scrambling, his pride collapsing beneath the weight of the revelation. Images rushed through his thoughts. The wedding, the toasts, the approving smiles of his family, and all of it now felt like a performance staged at his expense. You mean I married a man?" His voice cracked, sharp with disbelief. "I'm a woman," Eleanor said firmly, her tears shining but her posture straightening. "I've always been a woman. This is who I am. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you wouldn't love me, afraid you'd leave." But Daniel didn't hear the plea in her voice. What echoed in his head was humiliation. His pride, the foundation of his identity, felt shattered. He imagined his mother's face if she ever found out. The smirks of colleagues, the endless whispers, rage burned beneath his skin. "You lied to me," he spat. "Every kiss, every word. You lied. I loved you," Eleanor cried. "I still love you. Nothing about that is a lie." But Daniel recoiled, as though her words were poison. He turned toward the balcony, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles blanched. The sea stretched into darkness, vast and endless. But he felt trapped. Trapped in a marriage he no longer understood, trapped in a truth he couldn't bear. From that night on, their cabin became a battlefield of silence. Daniel withdrew, speaking only in clipped sentences. Eleanor tried to reach him, but her efforts were met with cold stares or muttered accusations. She slept with the lights on, as though brightness could ward off the shadows growing between them. Days passed, but the tension only thickened. Passengers noticed the change. Where once the couple had seemed inseparable, now they dined apart, Daniel brooding at the bar, while Eleanor sat alone on deck, staring at the horizon with haunted eyes. Inside, Daniel, anger hardened into obsession. He replayed their entire relationship, dissecting every glance, every pause, convinced that deceit had infected it all. The love he once felt seemed distant, replaced by a need to reclaim control, to punish the betrayal he believed had destroyed him. Elena, meanwhile, spiraled into despair. She had hoped that love would be enough, that Daniel would see her for who she truly was. Instead, her greatest fear had been realized. Rejection, not just from a man she loved, but from the life she thought she had built. The cruise sailed on, carrying them farther from New York, farther from the familiar and deeper into the storm of their unraveling marriage. What had begun as a celebration of forever was transforming, hour by hour, into a descent toward tragedy. Neither of them knew it yet, but the sea that sparkled so beautifully by day would soon bear witness to a night of fury and silence. A night when the tension in cabin 7A would erupt into violence that could never be undone. The storm began just after nightfall, rolling in from the east with blackened skies and a wind that screamed against the hull of the Ocean Serenity. Passengers hurried indoors, abandoning the open decks as rain lashed sideways and lightning clawed across the horizon. Inside cabin 7A, however, the storm had begun long before the first drop of rain touched the ship. Daniel sat in the corner, nursing his third glass of whiskey, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap, her face pale but resolute. For hours they had circled each other in silence, words swallowed, resentment growing like a tide they could no longer hold back. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was low, venom threaded through every syllable. "Do you know what you've done to me?" Elena looked up, her eyes glistening. "I told you because I love you, because I couldn't carry the weight of silence anymore." "You mean everything to me, Daniel." "Love?" He laughed bitterly, slamming the glass onto the nightstand. "You call this love? You lied to me. You let me stand in front of God, my family, my friends, while hiding what you are." "I am not hiding," Elena said firmly, though her voice trembled at the edges. "I am a woman. I've always been one. I was afraid of this reaction, of losing you. But my love is real. Every word I've ever spoken to you was real." Daniel rose to his feet, towering over her. His shadow loomed as lightning lit the cabin in fleeting bursts. "You tricked me. You made me into a fool. Do you know what they'll say if this ever gets out? My parents, my colleagues, my entire life will be a joke." Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "This isn't about them. It's about us. We can face this together. People don't need to know. Please, Daniel, don't let pride destroy what we have." But Daniel was past hearing. His world, built on control and reputation, had cracked. Every glance at Elena now replayed in his mind like a cruel deception. Every laugh, every kiss, rewritten by rage. He felt stripped, humiliated, and powerless. The storm outside roared louder, waves slamming against the hull. The cabin lights flickered. Eleanor stood, closing the space between them, her voice breaking but insistent. "Look at me. I am the same person you fell in love with, the same woman you wanted to marry. My past doesn't erase that. I need you to see me, Daniel, not your fears, not your pride, just me." For a moment, her words seemed to reach him. His hands trembled, his eyes softened briefly, but then he remembered the imagined faces of his family, the smirks of men at his office, the whispers behind his back. The image of being a victim of deceit burned hotter than any tenderness. "You should have told me from the beginning," he hissed. "I wanted to," Eleanor pleaded, clutching his arm. "But every time I tried, I saw how much you wanted the fantasy, the perfect story. I thought if I gave you time, if I proved my love, you'd accept me fully." "You stole my choice," Daniel roared, shoving her backward. She stumbled against the bed, catching herself, fear flashing across her face. "Daniel, please," she whispered. "Violence won't change the truth. You'll regret this." But he no longer felt regret. He felt a dark clarity, as though every storm cloud outside had gathered inside his chest. His breathing quickened, his fists clenching and unclenching. He moved toward her, step by step, like a predator circling prey. Elena tried again, desperate. "We can fix this. We can go home, see a counselor, talk to your family when you're ready. Don't throw our love away in anger." Her voice cracked, fragile against the thunder. Daniel's face twisted. "You made me a laughingstock before my life even began. Do you understand? You destroyed me. and with that, he lunged, his hands wrapped around her throat before she could react. Eleanor gasped, clawing at his wrists, her eyes wide with terror. The storm outside seemed to echo her struggle, the wind howling, waves pounding, lightning tearing open the sky. She tried to speak, to plead one last time, but her words dissolved into strangled sounds. Tears streamed down her cheeks as her nails scratched his skin, leaving red lines across his arms. For a fleeting moment, Daniel saw her face, the woman who had laughed with him in Central Park, who had kissed him under city lights, who had whispered promises of forever. But the image warped, consumed by his fury. His grip tightened. Seconds stretched into eternity. Elena's body thrashed, then weakened. Her eyes, once filled with desperate life, dulled as her movements slowed. With a final shuddering breath, she went still. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the storm's relentless fury. Daniel released her, stepping back as though burned. His chest heaved, his hands shook violently, but the reality before him was undeniable. Elena lay sprawled on the carpet, her hair fanned out, her body limp. Daniel staggered to the balcony door, flinging it open. Rain slashed across his face, cold and merciless. He stared into the black sea below, contemplating what to do. He thought of throwing her overboard, of erasing the evidence in one violent act of concealment. But his legs refused to move her body. He was paralyzed, not by conscience, but by the crushing weight of what he had done. Behind him, the cabin felt suffocating, a tomb for the love that had died long before Eleanor's final breath. He sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "She lied to me," he muttered, over and over, as if repetition might transform guilt into justification. The storm raged on, indifferent. Passengers elsewhere on the ship clutched one another, unaware that in cabin 7A, a love story had ended in silence and ruin. By morning, the storm would pass, the sun would return, gilding the decks in light as if nothing had happened. But inside that small cabin, the consequences of pride, secrecy, and rage lay irrevocable. The honeymoon was over, and soon the investigation would begin. The once luxurious cruise ship no longer felt like a floating palace. By dawn, its glittering decks were sealed off by yellow tape, officers pacing like wolves cornering prey. The passengers, once carefree vacationers, were now potential witnesses, trapped in a crime scene at sea. Murmurs swept through the corridors, fragments of disbelief stitched together by fear. The investigation began swiftly. Authorities questioned every passenger who had glimpsed Daniel and Rebecca the night before. Their recollections painted a picture darker than the midnight waters outside. Some remembered Rebecca storming past them, her eyes red from tears. Others recalled Daniel slurring, his voice rising, hands gesturing wildly as though flinging accusations into the humid air. When officers confronted Daniel in his cabin, they found a man unrecognizable from the polished groom of only days earlier. His clothes were rumpled, his knuckles raw, and his story fractured. First, he claimed Rebecca had vanished. Then he suggested she had slipped and fallen. With every retelling, his excuses tangled, leaving holes large enough for suspicion to pour through. The detectives exchanged knowing looks. His grief was performative, his panic too rehearsed. Word of the tragedy spread faster than the ship itself could move. By the time they docked, the news had already detonated across New York. Headlines screamed in bold black print, "Bride murdered on honeymoon cruise." The nation watched, horrified, yet enthralled, as television anchors dissected every detail. But the coverage carried a cruel edge. Once tabloids unearthed Rebecca's transgender identity, the story spiraled beyond murder. Talk shows framed her life as a spectacle. Some voices expressed sympathy, condemning the violence born of prejudice. Others, uglier, questioned whether Rebecca had deceived her husband, as if her authenticity were on trial alongside Daniel's crime. The media frenzy reduced a woman's life to a debate topic. Her smile, her career, her dreams, overshadowed by strangers weaponizing her identity. Advocacy groups rallied, holding vigils and demanding justice not only for Rebecca, but for every trans woman vilified in death as much as in life. Her friends stood before cameras, their voices trembling with both rage and love, reminding the world that Rebecca had been more than a headline. She had been human. Meanwhile, Daniel's fate darkened. Extradited from international waters back to the United States, he faced the cold machinery of justice. Prosecutors unveiled transcripts of his interrogations where he confessed not with sorrow but with bitterness. He claimed betrayal, insisting Rebecca's identity had been hidden from him, an assertion disproven by her friends, her documents, and even text messages where he acknowledged the truth long before the wedding. In the courtroom, Daniel's temper returned to life. Witnesses described him pounding the table, his voice cracking into shouts about humiliation and being lied to. But the jury saw through him. They saw a man incapable of accepting love without control, a man who mistook his rage for irrighteousness. When the verdict came, guilty of murder, Daniel sat stone-faced. Life imprisonment stretched before him, a sentence echoing the finality of Rebecca's silenced future. Yet outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some weeping, some cheering, all tangled in the emotions of justice and loss. The story closed for the courts, but not for the world. Rebecca's name lived on in op-eds, candlelight vigils, and conversations that questioned how society views love, gender, and truth. Her death became both a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. And for Daniel, locked behind bars, the walls echoed only with the truth he had tried to silence, a truth that refused to die. The trial's conclusion left the courtroom heavy with silence. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for statements, and the public dissected every word. Yet beneath the noise lingered the deeper question: what had truly been on trial? Daniel's crime, or the prejudices of a society still unprepared for uncomfortable truths? In the weeks following the verdict, commentators filled television screens, their voices echoing across the nation. Some spoke with sympathy for Evelyn, framing her as a victim of both her husband's violence and the media's cruel fixation on her identity. Others, less charitable, reduced her entire life to the moment of disclosure, as if her humanity could be erased by a headline. Her friends, interviewed in hushed tones, described a woman who longed for love, acceptance, and the simple joy of being seen for who she was. They spoke of her laughter, her fierce intelligence, and the courage it had taken to live authentically. Their testimonies painted a portrait of a woman far richer than the one-dimensional caricatures splashed across tabloids. Meanwhile, Daniel sat behind bars, his face hollow, his arrogance stripped away. In letters intercepted during his imprisonment, he wrote obsessively of betrayal, how he felt tricked, cornered, humiliated. Yet nowhere in those writings was there recognition of Evelyn's suffering, of the final terror she endured in their cabin as he chose violence over compassion. His words revealed a man consumed not by love, but by ownership and rage. The tragedy forced uncomfortable conversations. Couples asked themselves what it meant to truly know a partner. Families debated at dinner tables about secrecy, honesty, and the cost of silence. Advocates seized the moment to highlight the dangers transgender people face daily, not just from strangers, but sometimes from those they love most. In New York, a candlelight vigil was held. Dozens gathered, holding photographs of Evelyn smiling in moments of freedom. The glow of candles flickered against the night, a fragile defiance against the darkness that had consumed her life. A speaker's voice trembled as they addressed the crowd. She deserved safety, she deserved love, she deserved tomorrow. For those who listened, the case became more than another true crime headline. It became a mirror, reflecting both society's prejudices and its capacity for empathy. Some saw only scandal, but others recognized the urgent need for change, for a world where identity was not a death sentence, where truth was not punished with blood. The ship had sailed on without her, carrying with it witnesses who would never forget the screams that pierced the ocean night. But the greater voyage was the one left to society, whether to drift further into cycles of fear and hatred, or to chart a course toward understanding and compassion. In the end, Evelyn's story stood as both warning and call to action. Her life was cut short, but her truth remained unyielding, undeniable, and echoing far beyond the courtroom walls.